Hi, hello.
Hello, I'm here.
Okay, nice to see you. Yeah. So it's evening here, so I would say, but I would say good afternoon for you, right?
Yes, it is good afternoon for me. Yes.
Okay. Have you had a coffee?
Yes, I have. I have, thanks.
I had 2 coffee today, morning one and afternoon one. Okay. How many coffees will you have? Do you have usually?
Yeah, I think just one.
Okay, just one. So I will briefly introduce you later, okay? A very short, speech, and then I will briefly introduce you. When I introduce you, I will invite you share your slides. Is it okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Nice to see you here. Okay, so hello, my fellow colleagues and friends. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I warmly welcome you to the forum. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Hu Shenai from Xiamen University. In the following 2.5 hours, we will discuss language acquisition and linguistic diversity. And today I'm honored to introduce you to 4 of the best scientists in linguistics and psycholinguistics. Professor Iansi Tispling from University of Cambridge, Professor Maria Teresa Guasti from University of Milano Bicocca, Professor Ana Gavarró from Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and Professor Gennaro Chiacchia from Harvard University. And for them, each of them will give a 30-minute speech, followed by 5 minutes for discussion. For those who join us online, you may post your questions directly in the chat window. Okay, so now I will press Tispling. Please share your screen. Okay, share your slides. Okay. So, and I will briefly introduce you. So the first speaker is Professor Iansi Tispling, and from the University of Cambridge. She received her PhD in linguistics from University of College London. Before moving to Cambridge, she held the positions at the University of Reading and at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Okay, Tispling is also associate editor of Glossa and a member of the editorial boards of several international journals. She mainly focuses on first or second language development in neurotypical children and adults, as well as in individuals with language or cognitive delays or impairment. And her most recent one is on multilingualism in primary school children in India. And today she will talk about it. So welcome, Professor Tispling, please. Hi.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Can you see my screen? Yeah?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, good, excellent. Okay, let me start then by thanking you for inviting me to this event. I'm very honored to. It's my first talk in China, actually, although I'm not there. Can I just check that you can all hear me well and you can see my screen?
Very clear, very well for me.
Okay, good, excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks. So this talk is about work that I have recently carried out in India, which focuses on multilingualism and linguistic diversity. And I will talk about the subpart of the project that was a large project, and we had very many different tasks, experiments, and questionnaires. So within today's talk, I will focus on language and cognition in primary school children in India. So the aim of my talk is to discuss the effects of multilingualism in the individual speaker, in this case, the child, and in the society. So linguistic diversity in the context in which this child is raised, and what these effects are on cognition and on literacy from the perspective of children who grow up in socioeconomically underprivileged contexts. So these are the children that I'll be focusing on are severely deprived in many ways. But overall, I don't have an effect of socioeconomic status because all of the children that I'm focusing on are from low SES. SES stands for socioeconomic status. So one thing that I would like to point out first is that when we look at multilingualism in the global north, we usually, that is in Western societies, we consider socioeconomic status, but the differences are usually measured in terms of how educated the parents are of these individual children that we're looking at. But in Western societies, usually educational provision and societal welfare and support are typically good. So they are, in a sense, we have a certain level of standards for schools, and the educational training that teachers have encourages the children to interact, develops their critical thinking skills, and in any case, they are supposed to be similar and quite of good standard across children. Usually in studies in Western societies, linguistic diversity is either very low or ignored in these studies. So we're looking at whether children are bilingual, monolingual, multilingual, but we're not looking at the community in which these children are raised, and we're not looking at the school community either that these children are educated in. So the Multilila project is the project that I'm talking about. This was a 4-year project that finished in July 2020, and it aimed to address the question of multilingualism in school children in India. And as you know, India is a very linguistically diverse society. So the project was asking about what are the effects of multilingualism on children's cognitive and school skills. As I mentioned before, the focus of my study is on children in government schools, in state schools, and children that go to government schools in India are typically coming from low socioeconomic background. Now, the project was, as I said, a large project. It was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council with FCDO. The title was Multilingualism and Multiliteracy, Raising Learning Outcomes in Challenging Contexts in Primary Schools Across India. And what you see on your screen are my collaborators. So I had 2 collaborators at the time from the UK, Theo Marinis and Janine Treffers-Daller. And I had 3 collaborators from India, Suvarna Aladi, who is a neurologist from the National Institute for Mental Health and Neuroscience in Bangalore, Minati Panda, who is a psychologist focusing on school psychology and educational studies, and Lina Mukhopadhyay, who is a professor of applied linguistics at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. And there was a very large number of research assistants and research associates that helped us collect all this data. Now, in terms of background and focusing on multilingualism in the society, it is well known that India is among the most linguistically diverse countries in the world. And that's reported in UNESCO's publication on the Linguistic Diversity Index. There are 22 recognized languages by the Indian Constitution, and there are 121 languages that are spoken by more than 10,000 people. In total, the ethnologue suggests that there are 462 different languages spoken in the country. And in fact, if you add varieties of language, of these languages, you go close to 1,000 languages. The majority of primary schools, primary level classrooms are very multilingual, and this is because there are many migrants, internal migrants, that move from different parts of India into the urban areas, and that is between Indian states, but also within Indian states. And that migration leads to a very large amount of linguistic diversity, especially in slum areas and in other low socioeconomic status areas of Indian cities and urban spaces. Now, in terms of how well Indian children perform when it comes to school skills and learning outcomes, there is this annual status of education report that seems to test children every year, mostly in rural India, but also there are some studies of the same report in urban areas. And what they have shown in some of their studies is that there are children who are in primary school in year 5, and they cannot read a year 2 level text with fluency, and half of them cannot solve subtraction tasks that are appropriate for year 2 children. So there is a considerable problem with learning outcomes. And the problems with literacy and numeracy, when they are so low, they seem to limit the child's ability to develop critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And as a result, there are high dropout rates, which affect, unfortunately, girls more than boys. So there is a gender gap as well. And there is a gender issue in education where girls are more disadvantaged than boys. Now, in our project, in our study, the problem we were trying to address is this major problem, which is what causes low learning outcomes in primary school children in India. And the context from which we addressed is that you probably know that there is a lot of heated discussion nowadays about whether bilingualism gives you some advantages, at least in non-verbal cognitive abilities, or not, okay? And there is a debate going on. There are studies that show advantages. There are studies that don't show advantages. And of course, the way to address this is to look at different populations of bilinguals to see whether there are other factors that seem to affect the findings one way or another. So the research question that we addressed was, why is it that children in India actually don't seem to benefit from being bilingual or multilingual and present these low learning outcomes in their performance? So in terms of the possible causes of these learning outcomes, one important question is the language of education. So given the vast linguistic diversity that we have in India, it is very likely that the child that goes to school will be educated in a language that is not spoken at home. Okay, so this child is presented with a language that is likely very unfamiliar to the child. So the language of education is the focus of the project, but we also looked at other aspects, which is low socioeconomic status that these children have, and what that translates into is poor literacy support from home. So the parents are not educated themselves, so they cannot help the children learn how to read and write and do maths. There is poor attendance, so children miss school very often. And also many of the children have to work in the afternoon. So after they come back from school, they have to work in the market. So all these are causes of, that lead to low learning outcomes. The other reality in India is that the class sizes are very large. So you can have classrooms with 50 children. There are poor resources, and the pedagogies are very teacher-centered. In this cases, critical thinking is not prioritized. There is limited creativity or expression of independent thought because it's not encouraged by the educational system. And there are many children that are overage. That is, as you will see in our data, there are children in year 4 who actually range from 7 years old to 12 or 15 years old. So in our study, we focus on whether children who learn through the medium of a language that they're not familiar with have different learning outcomes than those children whose home and school languages are the same. Now, in India, one of the, let's say, very significant features in education is the role of English. And it's not just in education, but in the whole of the society. So English is the language of power, and it is the way to improve one's socioeconomic position in India. So there is a lot of parental pressure. Parents want children to have English as early as year 1 or year 3 in primary school, and they would like English to be used as the medium of instruction. So the problem in these cases is that levels of English remain low because the teacher's level of English is not sufficiently high to allow them to use English as the language of teaching. And also, as I said before, there is limited home literacy support because parents are usually unable to help the children with their development, their school skill development. So in many cases, English medium instruction is only in name, and the actual teaching takes place in the local language. Now, the question that we wanted to focus on is the medium of instruction in school. So what is it that happens when the medium of instruction is not, let's say, an Indian language or a language that children in that school know well? So there is a gap in India. There is this division, let's say, between private schools and government schools, state schools. And the private schools promise English medium instruction, which means English textbooks, English assessment, and English as the language of teaching. Whereas government schools used to teach in Indian languages only. Now that caused a lot of problems because that aggravated the socioeconomic differences between children that had, their parents had the money to fund private education. Whereas children who are not from richer backgrounds, they were disadvantaged because they wouldn't learn English either. They would have to learn and be educated in their in the regional language. So as a result, what happened in India is that there have been a lot of new private schools that are low cost. So people who are not middle class can actually attend these schools. And these low-cost private schools promise English medium instruction, right? So they have English as the medium of teaching, the language of the textbooks, and English assessment. Now, the government decided that they need to do something about these more disadvantaged children who cannot afford to go to private schools. And so they decided in many states of India to offer English medium instruction in order to address these social inequities. Okay, so they give the opportunity to households with children from lower socioeconomic background to attend English medium schools. And the question I would like to address, and we addressed in that project, is this the right way to go? The reason why this is a major question is that, as Ajit Mohanty has mentioned in a lot of his work, there is a double divide which arises from the medium of instruction. So there are children that will go to English medium schools as opposed to Hindi medium or Telugu medium, so regional language schools. And then there are children who speak a regional language at home, and therefore if they go to a school where this regional language is used as a medium of instruction, they will have a match between the home language and the medium of instruction language. All children in India, however, all low socioeconomic background children in India have one of the Indian languages or more at home, but they don't have English at home. So when these children go to be educated in an English medium school, they are disadvantaged because they do not speak the language that they're educated in. There is the double divide lies in that there are children who are minority language speakers. That is, they speak some of the minority language, and I give you some examples here, like Lambadi, Bhojpuri, Tulu, Nagpuri, etc. And these minority languages are not, in many cases, mediums of instruction. So they're not used at school. Now, children who come from these minority languages might be at a double disadvantage compared to children who only speak one of the, let's say, regional languages that are used as mediums of instruction. And in our study, we tried to address that question too. So our field work was in Delhi, in Hyderabad, and in Patna. So Delhi, as you know, is the capital of India. And there the the regional language schools have Hindi. Hindi is the majority language, and it's also one of the link languages in India. And schools in Delhi can be either Hindi medium or English medium. And we're talking about government schools here, right? So Hyderabad is the capital of another state of India, of Telangana. And here there are, it is an urban city, of course, but it is not as, it is much more a migrant-oriented city with very high numbers of poor population than Delhi. In Hyderabad, it is Telugu, which is the regional language, and schools can be either Telugu medium or English medium. And finally, Patna is the capital of another state of India, Bihar. Bihar is one of the poorest, most disadvantaged states in India. But here, Hindi is also the language used, and schools are only Hindi medium, okay? So you have a comparison between English and Hindi medium schools in Delhi, English and Telugu medium schools in Hyderabad, and in Patna you only have Hindi. Now, what is, all this, what is a medium of instruction is something that is an official decision, right? So a particular school is going to be English medium or Hindi medium or Telugu medium, and that's decided by the government. But what actually happens in terms of language use in the class is something very different. So although in officially, let's say, English medium schools, what you have is English textbooks, English assessment, and the language of teaching is supposed to be English, we asked how much oral input do children receive in that official medium of instruction. So what we did in this paper that has just been published, we just looked at the linguistic reality of classrooms in Delhi and Hyderabad, okay? So we looked at the language used by teachers and children in English language classes and in mathematics classes in Delhi and Hyderabad. And we used that tool, which measures the oral language input. And as you can see, what we do in this tool is the observer of the classroom. So one of our research assistants was in the class. They were looking at the type of activity that the teacher engaged in, and they used one of the codes from here. This was a 30-minute observation. Okay, so all these correspond to minutes in the half-hour class. We looked at the languages that are used. Okay, you have the language codes here. And then we looked at the same 5 minutes, children's responses in terms of activities that they engaged with and the languages that the children used during these activities, okay? So that observation tool allowed us to measure quantitatively the amount of oral input that children get in each of the languages. And what we have in that paper that we've just published is this information about the sort of language use that is there in English medium schools in Delhi. Okay, so this is supposed to be a school where English is the language of teaching. And what you can actually see in terms of what the teachers use as a language is that they don't use any English alone, right? What they do is what we call language mixing, or you can say code switching or translanguaging, where they are mixing Hindi and English, okay? And this is 77% of the time. And the rest of the time they're using Hindi, okay? Now this is an English medium school. Children in that school, however, they use a little bit of English, they use Hindi half of the time, and they also use language mixing, all right? So interestingly, although it's an English medium school, there is no English alone that we find in teachers' language. Again, in Delhi, when you look at Hindi medium schools, you find that teachers, again, engage a lot in language mixing. And language mixing is, as I said, primarily Hindi and English, okay? That doesn't preclude other languages that are, used by the children and the teacher. So you could find minority languages also being mixed with Hindi and English, but primarily the mixing is between Hindi and English, and the rest is Hindi. And this is what the learners are doing. So they have a lot more Hindi and a little bit of English and some language mixing as well. Okay. Now, when you move to Hyderabad, where we have Telugu medium schools and English medium schools, and we focus on English medium, we see that in Hyderabad, the teachers do actually use some English only, not even half of the time, but more than in Delhi. And they also engage in language mixing a lot. So they're mixing Telugu with English, but other languages as well. When you look at the learner language, again, you see a large variety. So you see some English, you see some Telugu, you see language mixing, and of course, you see a little bit of Hindi. And this just refers to the time when children engage in activity, but they're not verbally producing something. And finally, in Telugu medium schools, again in Hyderabad, so in the regional language schools, you also find English, okay, 20% of the time, both in the teacher language and in the learner language. And you find some language mixing again here too. So you can appreciate, I hope, that although in principle, these schools are officially one language only, okay, actually the reality of the classroom is that there is a lot of language mixing going on, and multilingualism is the norm. So in our study, we had, I give you a rough presentation of the total data size. We assessed 2,500 participants, children, from year 4 and year 5. And year 4 and year 5 are the same children in Delhi and Hyderabad. And we had 900 children in Patna, in Bihar. All the children were assessed in literacy, in narratives, in numeracy, and mathematical reasoning, in cognitive tasks. And we had questionnaires as well to find out the background of the child in terms of language and socioeconomic status. And we also used teacher questionnaires for our purposes. So, but today I'm not going, of course, to have the time to talk about everything. I will just focus on literacy. So how is children's literacy affected by multilingualism and by the choice of medium of instruction, the type of school you go to? And how is their cognitive performance affected by multilingualism and this social linguistic diversity that is very salient in India? So as you know, literacy involves basically two aspects. It involves decoding, so being able to read letters and characters, and reading comprehension, okay? So reading comprehension is the ultimate aim of reading. And therefore, in order to have a good view of what literacy abilities are, we need to test both decoding and reading comprehension. And we look for effects of medium of instruction, which type of school. They go to English school, Hindi school, or Telugu school. We look at the children who speak a language that is not a regional language, okay, one of these minority languages. And we look at the three different sites, Delhi, Hyderabad, and Patna. So in this study, and this is a paper that we have submitted and is under review now, we looked at the performance of 1,272 children from these different areas, and they all come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and they're all in year 4. But remember, I said that in India, it is very standard to be over age within a particular year. So what you find is that this is the number of children in Delhi, in Patna, and in Hyderabad. And what you see is that within year 4, you have children between the ages of 8 to 12, 7 to 15, and 7 to 15 in Patna and Hyderabad, right? So what you see is that children who are 12 years old are in the same class as children who are 8 years old, and of course, children in between, in ages in between. Now, we looked at how many of these children were monolingual and how many were multilingual in their households, right? In their homes, okay? Because almost everyone is multilingual if you look at adult Indian speakers, right? They have learned many languages. But when you actually stick to what is happening at home, then you can distinguish between monolingual and multilingual children. And what we find is that basically across all 3 sites, there is a distribution of monolingual and multilingual children. So there is a good percentage of bilingual or multilingual children who use multiple languages in the household. The majority are monolingual, okay, in both Delhi and Patna. But in Hyderabad, actually, it's very close to half and half, yeah? So there are many, many children who speak different languages at home. But when you look at actually minority languages in the home, which is different from being monolingual or multilingual, in minority languages, you find that in Delhi and in Patna, minority language speakers at home are very few, right? So in Patna, it's only 3% who's claim to speak minority languages. It's higher in Delhi, 18%, but the highest percentage is in Hyderabad. Remember, I said that in Hyderabad, there's a lot of internal migration going on, and there are many migrants from other parts of India that actually come to that city. Now, in total, in terms of numbers, out of the 1,272 children, 265 are minority language speakers, and they speak any of these minority languages, right? So we wanted to assess these children and evaluate their performance also separately from the children who are not minority language speakers to find out whether there is indeed a further disadvantage that these children have. So it is these children, the minority language ones, are educated in a language they don't speak at home because they neither have English at home and nor Hindi or Telugu. Okay, so they are definitely educated in a language that is not their home language. Now we use the literacy tool, the Acer literacy tool, that looks at how well you read letters, single words, sentences, passages, and how well you can answer comprehension questions, which is what we added to the Acer tool. And we administered these in Hindi, Telugu, and English, depending on the site. So English was used in all 3 sites of fieldwork, and Hindi and Telugu were also used. Hindi in Delhi and Patna, and Telugu in Hyderabad. So I give you some examples of word reading and story reading, and then one example of a comprehension question from the story. Now, these are some results that we have from how well they read in Hindi. Now, we looked at children that were going to English medium schools and Hindi medium schools. And what we find is that the children that are in Hindi medium schools actually perform better on story reading, and that's a significant difference, okay? But there was no significant difference in reading comprehension between English medium and Hindi medium. And there was an effect that the children from Patna were actually better on story reading, but again, there was no difference in comprehension. So I would like you to notice that, you know, obviously children are almost at ceiling with letters, right? And then their performance goes slightly down, which is as expected because it's more difficult to read words than letters, paragraphs and words, stories and paragraphs. And the most difficult part is usually understanding what you read. Okay, so reading comprehension. But in Hindi, their performance is pretty good. Now, when we turn to English and we look at the different groups with English medium schools offering English as the official language, Hindi or Telugu, what we find is that there isn't much difference, as you can see, but you can see how strikingly lower the performance is on word reading and paragraph reading and story reading. And the poorest results are in comprehension, where you can actually see the children perform really low on reading comprehension. So although they have some level of ability of reading English, they don't understand what they're reading, okay? So there is an effect of medium of instruction. So English medium children that go to English medium schools are, as expected, better than Hindi medium and Telugu medium children on story reading and in reading comprehension as well. But again, the performance is quite low. In fact, you will see that this is particularly low if you compare this with performance in Hindi. So I think there is an obvious conclusion here that even if you go to an English medium school, you do in India, you do not seem to be performing as well as you would if you were going to a school where an Indian language is used. There are some effects, however, of multilingualism on English literacy. So what we did in this table is to split the children according to whether they are monolingual at home or multilingual. And what you can see is that although here there isn't much of a difference, basically in every other aspect, multilingual children seem to be doing better in English literacy than monolingual children. So this is an independent finding that shows that if you speak more than one language, you're more likely to perform better in an additional language, let's say in a third language. And notice that English is not a language of multilinguals in our study, right? So English is not a home language for any of the children that we tested. So this is just the result of children having more languages than more than one language at home. Now, when we focus on minority language children, what we find is that, the dark green is the minority language children. And what we see is that they consistently, let's say, underperform across all parts of literacy compared to majority language children, which is what we expected, right? So minority language speakers have a disadvantage compared to majority language speakers when they're reading in the regional language. And this is expected because majority language speakers actually have the regional language as one of their home languages. And finally, when we put both the monolingual, multilingual aspect and the minority, majority language aspect together, and we look at performance in literacy in the regional language, right? So in the majority language, what we find is something which is very interesting. The red lines are monolingual children and the green ones are multilingual, okay? And you see for each component of literacy how monolinguals and multilinguals perform. And what you can see is that minority language children who happen to be monolingual as well, so these points seem to consistently underperform compared to multilingual children. But the worst, let's say, combination, the most of the disadvantages, the double divide disadvantages, seem to affect monolingual children who are minority language speakers. So these are the most disadvantaged children, regardless of whether they go to an English medium school or a regional language school. So the conclusion for literacy is that the majority of children who read the text in the regional language, that is Hindi or Telugu, were able to answer comprehension questions, which is good news. And when the text matched the medium of instruction, then children performed better on literacy subtests. Okay, so the English medium school children performed better in English than the other children in English. But there is a discrepancy in performance across the cities, and that's attributed mostly to language policy and use, because as you saw from the classroom observation, in terms of oral input, there is more English that is offered to children in Hyderabad than children in Delhi, okay? And this is true both in English medium schools and regional language schools. So the results are not unexpected in that respect, but we need to take into account that what English medium is in Hyderabad, in Delhi, in other parts of India is not the same, right? We always need to keep in mind that there is more or less English offered to the children depending on the text, on the context. So when we turn to society now, to linguistic diversity, this is reported in a paper that we published last year. And we looked at cognitive abilities in multilingual children, and the cities we focused on were Delhi and Hyderabad. So for this study, we focused on 687 children, roughly half of them from Delhi and half from Hyderabad. Again, they are in years 4 and 5, okay? And we distinguished between medium of instruction and also whether they were living in slums or in non-slum areas. But remember, all of them are from low socioeconomic background. Now, the question that arises is, what is social linguistic diversity and why should it matter to language development? Why isn't it enough to look at the multilingualism of an individual, to find out whether a child speaks one language, two languages, three varieties, or whatever? Why isn't that enough? Why should we look at what happens around the child in terms of language diversity? And this is a picture that I would like to show you. This is always a population of 3. They're just 3 individuals in all cases. But the amount of linguistic diversity differs. I hope you can see that. So down here, there is no linguistic diversity because they're all monolinguals and they share the same language. Here, there are 3 people, again, they're all monolinguals, but they don't share any language, okay? And here you have a different type of diversity. All these bubbles are different languages. So this person is bilingual in 2 languages that are different from the 2 languages that this person is bilingual in. And here we have these 2 guys are sharing, they are sharing one of the languages, but this is not shared by this person. So you can imagine that this person is a minority language speaker, okay? These people are sharing, let's say, a majority language, but they also have other languages that they speak. So I hope you can appreciate with this graph, this picture, that linguistic diversity is not a matter of how many people are around you, but what their language skills are in different languages, okay? So what we did is we developed a survey, a social linguistic diversity questionnaire that we use with the children that we tested. And what we asked the children about is about 3 contexts in their everyday life: the school context, the family context, and the community context. And what we asked them is, can you tell me about the people you talk to every day at school, apart from your best friends, okay? And then we asked them to name 1, 2, or 3 people who they they see every day and they interact with, and ask about the age of these people, the gender, and the language profile of these people. We did the same with family. How many members of your family live with you? Because in India, it's very common to have extended families living together. So not just parents and siblings, but aunts, uncles, grandparents, and so on. And community as well. The same question about the community, because as I said, many children work in the afternoons after they come home from school, and they meet different people in the market. We tested them on Ravens, which is a nonverbal IQ task. And it's more like solving a puzzle, basically. So you have to look at the pattern, and then you have to identify which of the 6 ones below fit this pattern. So in this case, it's number 4. And then we had updating skills. Okay, so we looked at it's one of the executive functions. Updating is one of the executive functions that includes attention and inhibition. So you are presented with a series of individual digits. And when you see a digit that is the same as the digit that you saw 2 trials back, then you have to press a key. But in all other cases, you don't press anything. Okay, so here you have to press J on your keyboard because you saw a 5 2 trials back. And here again, you have to press because there was a number 2 trials back. So that is a task that tests complex working memory, let's say, but also your ability to update information. Now, what we found in terms of these cognitive tasks is that actually there is an advantage of children who were from bilingual or multilingual households compared to the ones that were from monolingual households. And there was a positive effect on Ravens, so the nonverbal intelligence, and on the 2-back task, on the updating task. So those children that were bilingual were significantly performing better than the monolingual children. Interestingly, we didn't find any main effect of contextual linguistic diversity, of the social linguistic diversity. But what we did is we found a significant interaction between bilingualism and social linguistic diversity. So here you have the Raven scores, the nonverbal IQ tests, and here you have the social linguistic diversity score. So the higher the score, the more diversity in the environment of the child. And what you can see, as expected, the green dots are bilingual or multilingual children, and the red ones are the monolingual household children, right? Now, it is expected that there will be more diversity here, but what we found in the bilingual children, but what we found was that children who were from monolingual homes had higher Raven scores if they were in an environment where there is more social linguistic diversity. Okay, so children that come from monolingual homes, when their school or the community in which they lived was more diverse, linguistically diverse, these children actually performed better in Ravens, in the nonverbal intelligence test, which is a very good outcome, let's say, because of concerns that people have raised about whether being among multilingual individuals, even if you are not yourself multilingual, is actually going to take away from your ability to benefit from education. This actually shows the opposite. So these are the final slides. So we did find an effect of medium of instruction. So somehow the children in Delhi and Patna had higher performance in the updating task than the children in Hyderabad, and that was a medium of instruction effect. And that was also true for Raven. So you can actually see that the children in Delhi who come from the capital, let's say, seem to perform better than the children in Hyderabad. Although I have to say that one of the reasons here has to do with the overall lower socioeconomic status that children in Hyderabad had. So to conclude this presentation, it seems that from our data, multilingualism in the individual seems to be beneficial for cognition, but also for literacy skills in an additional language, right? So this is for English. If you speak more than one Indian language, you are better at literacy development in English. Also, linguistic diversity in the society, in the context, seems to enhance the cognitive skills of monolingual children. And of course, we confirmed what has been shown in previous research, that children that are educated in a language that they don't speak at home are disadvantaged in literacy development. And I have to say that all of these conclusions are relevant to children that come from disadvantaged backgrounds. What I mean by that is that these conclusions are relevant to children whose homes cannot offer literacy support or on school skill development. And only schools are expected to help these children. And for these children, this is the effect. So in all, what I think is the outcome of this is that multilingualism needs to be reconsidered as a form of language experience, okay, in the same way that education is language experience, which combines linguistic diversity in the society and multilingualism in the individual. So these are two factors that we need to take into account in our studies. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great talk. Thank you for the beautiful work. And there are some questions for you. So here's a question for you from Huang Haiqian. Haiqian, you're here, right?
Hi. Yes. Hi. Nice to meet you, Professor Simply. Very nice talk. Thank you very much. My question is, so your study suggests that language diversity plays a positive role in the children's development of cognition. Is that right? Just a clarification question.
Yeah, so what we found is that linguistic diversity in the context where they live, you know, in their everyday family, school, or community context, offers an advantage in nonverbal intelligence. I think you've got to, yeah. Sorry, did I answer your question? Yeah, that was our finding.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I'm very terrible sorry. During some technical problems, we are trying to solve it. I'm terrible sorry about it. Okay, so I speak something stupid for my dear audience. Okay, so I think there's another question for you from Professor Ai Jin, right? Ai Jin, you are here, right? Ai Jin. Oh, yeah. Okay, Zhen Hao, please. Zhen Hao, you are here, right? Hi. Okay, hi. Okay.
And Professor.
Okay.
Okay, Professor Huang, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hi, are you here?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
I have Professor Trimpley. I have small questions. So, in your research, you claim that children from multilingual homes benefit from social linguistic diversity. So, my question is that are there some differences between early children and later children in such statement?
Well, we didn't find any advantage of social linguistic diversity on bilingual or multilingual children. We only found an advantage of social linguistic diversity on cognition, children coming from monolingual homes. mean, in a sense, it is expected, right? Because if you are bilingual or multilingual, you already have a level of diversity in your environment. So in the graph I showed you, it was clear that, you know, the bilingual children had a higher social linguistic diversity score because obviously there are more languages that are spoken around them. But where we found the advantage in the Ravens task was in children from monolingual homes, right? So those children have one language at home, but apparently in their school or in the community, they interact regularly on a daily basis with individuals who have a higher, let's say, number of languages that they speak. So even though the children themselves don't speak these languages, the fact that they are surrounded by multilingualism in their environment seems to have a positive effect.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thanks. Okay, Professor Maria Teresa Guasti has a question. Teresa, please.
Yeah. Yanti, I don't know if you tested the other cognitive abilities or if you find that in some cognitive ability, children with a multilingual environment or multilingual speaking, with respect, so some cognitive ability are fine and other cognitive ability are not. I am asking this question because there is some concern that the tests that are used for measuring cognitive ability are often based on a weird population, namely population Western educated people. And so we may think that these children in India have a different experience and in some other task they are not so good, but which doesn't mean that they are not good because they are on some of the tasks, but there is a cultural difference.
Yeah. So in that paper that I mentioned and I referred to the data from, the children, first of all, we use for Ravens, we use the norms that were found in, they were developed in India for Ravens. Nevertheless, unfortunately, the norms that were developed in India for Ravens were with children, were with a sample of children that came from private schools and from, let's say, a higher socioeconomic background. So in the end, we had to use raw data to analyze you know, the different variables that we had. There is a cultural effect, and in that paper that I mentioned, we do say that although Ravens is supposed to be culture free, let's say, it's not. I mean, we did find an effect, and overall they perform more poorly than Western children, you know, the Indian children, and this is true also for the norms that are available for India for Ravens. We also tested the children in NBAC, and we also tested the children in flankers, and I didn't report any of the flankers results because we haven't finished analyzing them. But there are certain cultural differences, but I have to say that, you know, the results that we found of, you know, social linguistic diversity, etc., we are only comparing within the group of children that we have, right? So we are not comparing with Western children or with, you know, other, you know, high SES within India either. We are only looking at the children from government schools that we have. So in that sense, I think we are protecting the children's results in a sense because we're not comparing them with other norms. Tasks themselves, whether they are good for children in India or in the global South, you're absolutely right. You know, there are many concerns about that. And because we have found cultural effects, clearly we need to come up with different tasks to test the same thing which are more culture sensitive. Yeah.
Hi, there's another question from the chatting window. So Zhang Yuchen asked, do you consider the underperformance in literacy in minority language children could be due to the lack of teaching materials in this language? Please.
Well, I think that the minority language children are at a disadvantage because their minority language is not used outside the home. So at school, there is nothing in the textbooks, that refers to that language. And of course, the teacher is unlikely to use that language in class. So for the vast majority of children who come from minority language backgrounds, they are at a double disadvantage, whether they are in an English medium school. I mean, all the children that we looked at are at a disadvantage when they go to English medium school because English is not a language that is used at home. So they're not familiar with that language. But when you are a minority language speaker and you go to a school in Delhi or Hyderabad, even if it is a Hindi medium school or a Telugu medium school, you're still presented with a disadvantage because your language, the language you are familiar with, is not going to be the language of the school. I have to say that our results show that the minority language children do better in regional language schools than in English medium schools because although they don't have Telugu or Hindi at home, they are more familiar with the language because it is the majority language, right? These are majority languages. So in the community, these are the languages that are spoken. So they are more likely to perform better in reading in the majority language than in English.
Well, can I ask one question? Sorry. Can I ask one more question? I just
okay,
want,
please.
I'm just, yeah. Have you observed any effect of language iteration for bilingual children in your studies? Yeah.
A language attrition?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so we didn't, well, I don't think I can answer that question. The only thing I can say is that we can address that question because we have data from two years of development, let's say from year 4 and year 5, in both English and in the regional language. So we can see whether children actually develop more in one than the other. It's usually the case that if they go to an English medium school, the other language is going to start being, let's say, not shrinking necessarily, but if there is any evidence of attrition, it will be in the majority language if they go in an English medium school. But it seems to me that because we have some developmental data that we haven't analyzed yet, I have to say, we should be able to address that question.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, one last question, okay, from the chatting window from Li Jiang. So the question is following. So dear Professor Teespring, thank you for your great presentation. Yes, a great presentation, thank you. I have some questions. So do the social linguistic variables include the caste system in India, and is the cognitive ability of children affected by restricted code or elaborated code used by their guardians at home? Please.
Yeah, so thank you very much for these questions. I mean, these are great questions. The social linguistic variables that we used did not include caste. And the reason why we didn't include caste is because we were advised by our collaborators there that caste is, well, it is something that is politically incorrect, basically, and we don't want to put this to the forefront. Having said that, I have to say that there is an inevitable effect of caste because the children that go to government schools usually usually don't come from the higher castes, they come from lower castes. But we didn't actually take into account variation among the castes. So no, but we used the social linguistic variables we used included socioeconomic status questions, which because of the length of the presentation, I had to take out. But we do have a socioeconomic questionnaire, let's say, which asks for parents' profession and the gadgets that the children have in the household, whether they have running water at home or whether they need to get water outside. That's usually the case with children in slums, that there is a tap which is outside the slum and everybody has to get the water from there. So we have these types of variables that are included, but not caste. With regard to the cognitive ability of children and restricted code or elaborated code, I have to say that this is a question that refers more to the gender gap. So it is usually the case, especially in girls and boys that come from lower socioeconomic background, which is what our children are, that girls are, do not participate in a lot of, discussions that encourage critical thinking and, more input and more stimulation from topics that boys are exposed to. So I think if you mean by restricted code and elaborated code, the type of information that is presented to them, then I would say that this speaks to a gender gap.
Thank you, Professor Tisbury. Thank you for your great talk and for sharing so beautiful work, okay? So now I would like to invite Maria Teresa Guasti to give us talk. So Teresa, could you please share your presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so I will briefly introduce you when you're sharing your presentation, okay?
Okay.
So, yeah, Guasti, yeah. So Professor Maria Teresa Guasti works at the Department of Psychology at the University of Milano Bicocca. She holds a PhD from the University of Geneva. After being trained as a theoretical linguist, she has switched to language acquisition and has researched on first and early second language acquisition, on language impairments and dyslexia. Also, I would like to introduce her great textbook, Language Acquisition, The Growth of Grammar. So the book has been critical in shaping the education of many graduate students over the world. So in fact, my students are using this book now. So thank you, Teresa, for this great contribution to the field. So now, please, Teresa, your turn.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Shania, for your kind words. So today I am going to talk about bilingualism, biliteracy, and to show you that there is no penalty in being bilingual and biliterate, or even multiliterate. But here the situation are situation of biliteracy and bilingualism. In her work from the 2008, Kovelman and colleague show that reading abilities at the age of 8 years was related to the age of exposure to the oral language. In other words, the exposure to oral language matters for reading until at least age 8. Children exposed to the language before the age of 3 were better than children exposed to the oral language after the age of 3 in various abilities related to reading and in reading itself. So abilities like phonological awareness, phonological knowledge, morphological awareness, morphological knowledge, vocabulary, syntax, narrative ability, and comprehension of a text. In addition, in a work by Snorri and colleague, it has been found that poor language oral skill are linked to poor reading performance, both at the age of 8 years and at the age of 15 years. So there is a link between oral language and reading. Now, we know that bilingualism has an effect on oral language, and thus it may have an effect also on reading. In this talk, starting from this background, I will consider two conditions of becoming bilingual. One condition is concerned with Italian-speaking children who goes to a bilingual school, Italian-English. And the question that we are asking in this context is whether learning to read English in primary school slow down learning to read Italian. This question is important because many parents think that it is better to establish, to have a solid background in Italian reading before starting to read in English. Does this concern have some background or not? The other question related to this condition is whether Italian supports learning to read in English. The second condition has to do with immigrant children in Italy who either are literate only in Italian, because in mainstream school only Italian is taught, or children that are biliterate. So they are literate in Italian because they go to mainstream schools, but they are also literate in their own language because the community support this education. And the second question related to this condition that we will ask is whether the script system influence biliterate acquisition. The script system will be alphabetic, so the group of children in this study will be children coming from a language which has an alphabetic script or a language with a logographic script. And we ask whether the fact of being biliterate in one or the other system as their home language has an influence on learning to read Italian. So this study has been carried out with my PhD student Francesca Costa, and we will start with the immersion education, Italian and English. This study involved 121 bilingual children and 71 monolingual children. The children were all Italian-speaking children from Italian families who had been exposed to English from the age of 3 in kindergarten. Of course, at the age of 3 was oral language. Then they went to immersion school, and they continue to be exposed to English and Italian at school, and they were educated in both languages. At home, they speak Italian. So we have children from grade 1, children from grade 3, and children from grade 5th. We assess their language and reading abilities both in Italian and in English. For the bilingual, for the monolingual, we only assessed Italian, of course. So for the language, we assess vocabulary knowledge, expressive vocabulary, sentence repetition, and non-words repetition. Non-words repetition examine, let's say, phonological awareness, phonological knowledge. For reading, we used text, and we measure the velocity in reading, the accuracy, so number of errors, and the comprehension. So the first question that we are dealing with is, does double literacy slow down the achievement in Italian? And here we see the Italian result where we compare language and reading skills in children, bilingual and monolingual. So language, here are some graph. Here is the expressive vocabulary. The blue line are the bilingual children, the red line are the monolingual children, and here is the score at expressive vocabulary. As you can see, there is not a big difference between the two groups. There is increase in performance across grades as expected. In sentence repetition, we see the same picture. Children are almost exceeding already in grade 1. And for the pseudo word repetition, we have the same picture, and children are already with a very high performance already in grade 1. So essentially, as Italian is concerned, the children who are taught in English and Italian, of course, do not experience any disadvantage. Here we have reading text, and as you can see here, monolingual and bilingual reading velocity. Reading velocity is measured as number of syllables per second. There is no significant difference, but you can observe that in grade 1 and grade 3, the bilingual are quicker than the monolingual. In grade 5, there is no difference, but in any case, the most evident thing is that there is an improvement as expected across grade. For error in reading text, we have the grade and the number of errors. There are a few errors in grade 1, with bilingual doing a little bit, but not statistically significant. And the number of error decreases in grade 3 and 5th. So here is 5 error over the whole text in grade 1. As for text comprehension, again, there are no difference between the two groups, and there is an improvement across grades. So as far as Italian is concerned, children who attend a bilingual school do not suffer in the Italian performance. Now, for English, we don't have a monolingual group of English children. So what we can observe is only how English develop. And the results here, which I report in words rather than graph, shows that English vocabulary, sentence repetition, non-word repetition or pseudo-word repetition increases across grades as expected. And the same for reading. Reading velocity, accuracy, and text comprehension improves, all improve across the 3 grades. In addition, we found correlation between the measure in Italian and the measure in English. Specifically, those children that have a better vocabulary in Italian also have a better vocabulary in English. The same for sentence repetition and for non-word repetition. And similarly for reading, those children that are quicker in Italian are also quicker in reading English, and those that are more accurate in Italian are more accurate in English. So this shows that the 2 languages or Italian support the acquisition of English. Now, coming back to our questions at the beginning, does learning to read English in primary school slow down learning to read Italian, which is the majority language? And the answer is negative. Does Italian support English learning? Yes, because those that are better in Italian are better also in English. Now, we turn to a second learning condition, the learning condition of heritage language children, namely children who are second language learner of Italian. They are immigrant children, and at home they speak another language with the family, and so they are all bilingual. But within this group, there are also children that are biliterate beyond being bilingual. In other words, these children are also learning to read their home language. They do this during weekends or during the summer vacation, and they do this at school communities. So here are the children. We have 95 monoliterate children, bilingual children, but monoliterate, and we have 86 biliterate and bilingual children. The biliterate children are children coming from different languages. Now we are going to see the results of the whole group. But be aware, and we will return on that, that these children are have a home language, whose script can be either alphabetic, like, for example, Russian or Polish, or logographic, like Chinese children. As before, we have grade 1st, 3rd, and 5th. We assess more or less with the same material as before, with the addition that here we had a non-language measure, Raven, that you have just seen. We had expressive vocabulary for language, non-word repetition. We had for reading words, pseudo word in isolation, and reading text as before. And in both cases, we measured velocity, accuracy, and comprehension. So Raven, you have already seen what it consists of. Children have to fill this piece with the number 4. Yanti and I choose exactly the same picture, even if we didn't talk to each other. Okay, the first thing to know is that biliterate children in all 3 grades had a higher performance in the Raven than monoliterate children. So there is an advantage in being not only bilingual, but also biliterate. And here we have the measure of language. Here we have expressive vocabulary. The blue is the monoliterate and the red is the biliterate. Basically, there is no big difference between the 2 groups. Here you can observe that grade 3 is better than grade 5th, but you have to keep in mind that this is a cross-sectional study. So it doesn't mean that from grade 3 to grade 5th, your performance decreases, because it may simply be that this 5th grade was composed of children who were weaker than the children in grade 3. So it's a cross-sectional study. Pseudo word repetition, the monoliterate and the biliterate, and as you see, there is not a big difference. Again, the 2 groups are quite similar. And the performance is almost exceeding, which means that in terms of the phonology of the language, the 2 groups are quite good, even for Italian standard. Namely, the monolingual would be the same, although we don't have monolingual Italian in this study. Reading words and pseudo words. Let's start with the words and pseudo words in the velocity here. As you can see, so these are words or pseudo words in isolation. And what you can see is that there is an improvement in both groups across the 3 grades. You can also observe, if you compare words with pseudo words, that at the beginning they are read at the same pace, but then words are read faster than pseudo words. And this is expected because one typical process that happens in the reading acquisition in alphabetic languages is that in grade 3, there is an automatization of the reading process. So in grade 5th, children convert grapheme into phoneme in order to read. And this is a process that is very time consuming and they read very slow. But as children experience reading, they read automatically the all words, and this happen around grade 3. And when this happen, children can read very fast because they do not go through the process of grapheme phoneme conversion. If this does not happen, namely this dissociation between reading velocity of words versus non-words, if this does not happen, it means that there are problems with the child and the child may have dyslexia, so a reading impairment. What you see here is that both monoliterate and biliterate are progressing fast, very fast. However, there is a small advantage for the monoliterate, which are a bit faster in reading words than biliterate, although the difference, as you can see, is rather small. For error in reading words and non-words, here we have the monoliterate and here we have the biliterate. And what you can observe is that in grade 5th, there are several errors in reading words in both groups, a little bit more in the monoliterate than in the biliterate. But then this number of errors drops dramatically in grade 3 and 5th in both groups. As for reading text, we observe that the velocity again increases across the 3 grades. There is no significant difference between the 2 groups. As far as comprehension of the text is concerned, the biliterate, the red one, are better than the monoliterate, although toward grade 5th, the 2 groups tend to obtain the same score, but as you can see, in grade 5th and in grade 3, there is an advantage for the biliterate. So, summary, monoliterate are faster than biliterate in reading single words, but biliterate are better in text comprehension. Moreover, we also found correlation between oral language skills and reading abilities. Those children that are better in oral language are also better in reading. So, concerning our second question, does biliterate education penalize learning to read a second language, Italian, which is the majority language that these children experience? In fact, we cannot answer in the positive because we have seen that there are some advantages in one ability and some disadvantage in another ability. But overall, since reading a text has as a goal the comprehension, we can say that biliteracy is certainly better because reading is done for comprehension, not for reading faster. And we also observed that there was a cognitive advantage in being biliterate in the Raven score. Okay, the last point, the last part of this talk concern the script system. As I said, the biliterate children included children from languages that use an alphabetic script and children from languages that uses a logographic script, Mandarin in particular. So here are the two groups. The alphabetic group included 36 children and the logographic groups included 50 children. There is no difference between the two groups in the Raven score. So in this respect, being biliterate is what matters, not the script system. And here are the results from the measure that we have already seen. In expressive vocabulary, children from a language with an alphabetic script are better, but in grade 5th, they are similar. So it's only at the beginning, but then they catch up. In reading words and pseudo word, you can see here, these are the this graph refer to the logographic children and this graph to the alphabetic children. And in reading words, the logographic children were faster than the alphabetic children. And similarly also for reading pseudo words. So now the blue is the words and the red is the pseudo word. And so logographic children, children from languages with a logographic script are faster than children from an alphabetic script. Here we have the error. As you can see here, logographic children made more errors in grade 1st, but then in grade 3 and 5th, the number of errors decreases, and the same in alphabetic. So here, logographic children make more error, but only in grade 1st. Reading comprehension. So here we have red alphabetic and blue logographic. And what we observe is that the alphabetic are better in grade 1 than the logographic, but then things change and even reverse for the velocity in reading text. And here we have comprehension. The alphabetic children are better in grade 1st and 3rd, but then in grade 5th, they are the same. So does the script system influence biliterate acquisition? Yes, there are differences, but keep in mind that it is a cross-sectional studies. And sometimes the difference seems to be due to a specific grade more than the specific condition. In any event, in grade 5th, the two groups become similar. And again, we found the correlation between oral language skill and reading. So on average, what these two studies says is that being educated in two languages is not a penalty. And in fact, in some cases, it is even an advantage. It doesn't matter if your language has the same script system than the majority language or not, but you see an advantage both in cognitive abilities and in some ability related to language. Now, I want to speculate a little bit about what is the link that we have been observed between oral language and written language. So children who are better in oral language are also better in reading. And here I want to to propose the idea that what is the link is the ability to predict. So what does it mean? Reading is a process in which you process written linguistic material, and you process it before you utter it aloud, for example. In other words, when you are reading and you are uttering a certain word, your eyes are already processing something which is ahead of what you are uttering. This has been shown in a study by Laubrock and Kegel, 2015. And in this graph, essentially, what they showed is that while your voice, the green one, is uttering the first word, which is a German word, gegen, your eyes are already processing the fourth word, zwei. So there is a span, when you read aloud, there is a span, a delay between what you utter and what you are processing. And this is very useful if you want to read quickly. So if you want to read quickly, you have to dissociate your ability to utter and your ability to process what is coming 2 or 3 words ahead. Based on this idea, we have been doing work at the University of Milano Bicocca, but there are also other labs in the world that are working toward this direction on linguistic prediction. And this is work done in collaboration with 2 PhD students, Yasmin Bosch and Mathilde Chailleux and Fabrizio Rosio. And what I mean by predictive language processes is the following. So when you process language, you make prediction about which will be the next word, and you make this prediction on the basis of semantic, syntactic, and other cues. For example, here, if you have this picture in front of you and you hear, the boy will eat, you will look at the cake, because what you expect as a next word is the cake. There is nothing else which is edible. Similarly, for the second picture, if you hear the man has drunk, you will look at the empty glass, because the tense is past. And so if the glass is empty, it means that what was in was already drunk. And so the next word will be the wine, because this is a glass typical for wine. But if you listen to a sentence like, the man will drink in the future, you will look at the glass that is still full, and this is a glass of beer. I have a small example from Mandarin that I was provided. If you see this, if you hear a sentence in which there is this classifier way, you expect that the next word should be a word referring to a person, and therefore you will look at this boy rather than looking at the dog. So that's so classifier may lead you to predict what the next word could be. So we have found in several studies that the better you are at predicting in oral language, the better you are in reading. And this ability seems to matter also for dyslexia. And work related to this is published in Pagliarini and colleague 2020. So message to take home: learning to read 2 languages does not have negative effect. In fact, it has even a very positive effect on cognitive abilities and language abilities. Oral language matters for reading because of prediction. Oral language provides the scaffolding for reading quickly, correctly, and comprehending. Different learning conditions may boost different oral language and reading language skill. So there might be difference between the different learning conditions, but the basic message is that there is no penalty and children can catch up across the different grades. And with that, I thank you very much.
Teresa, thank you so much for speaking Chinese, Mandarin Chinese way. I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you so much, okay? So I suppose there are some questions, okay? So yes, please.
Hi, Maria.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Nice to meet you online. Thank you very much for sharing us with your interesting work. My question is related to your research technique. I just wonder what measure did you use in okay, how did you measure the participants reading velocity as well as the accuracy of the text comprehension?
Yeah. So first of all, what we measure was Italian, not the other language, or we measured English. So in terms of reading, for Italian, we measured the velocity in reading syllable. So velocity is number of syllable per second. What we did is you take the whole time that is spent in reading, I don't know, a list of words, and then you divide by the number of syllables of the text, and you have how many syllables per second is read. For English, we took the whole, so the time that was used to read the text. In terms of error, we measured how many error during while reading words the child did. So if the words was spelled in the wrong way. And for comprehension, we had a question that related to the text, and we measure whether the answer to the comprehension question was correct or not.
Okay. Thank you. How old are the participants?
So grade first is 6 years, grade 3 is 8 years, and grade 5th is 10 years, more or less.
All right, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay, Teresa, unfortunately, due to time limitations, so I would not invite other speakers to ask your questions, okay? And
Okay.
Thank you for your great talk, and thank you for saying Wei, okay? You are Wei, a great professor, supervisor for me, okay? Thank you, Teresa, thank you, okay? So let me invite the third speaker, Ana Gavarro, from University Autónoma de Barcelona. So Anna studied the Catalan language and literature at the Universidad de Barcelona and received her PhD in linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. So she started her research in theoretical linguistics and adult grammar. Since the 1990s, has focused on language deficits and first language acquisition. In acquisition, she has worked extensively on Catalan, but has also carried out numerous cross-lingual studies and done experimental work in languages such as Mandarin, Hindi, Urdu, and Polish, Greek. Okay, and today she will talk about the acquisition of syntax in infants. So Anna, could you please share your screen?
Thank you.
Hi, Anna.
Yeah.
Okay, Anna, please share your screen, please. Share your presentation slides, please.
Can you see my screen?
Not yet. I can see you.
Okay. Now?
Nice to see you, Anna. Yes, more or less. Okay.
Okay, so now you see my screen, yeah?
Yes, but so you need to adjust your slides. Okay.
Yeah, of course. Full screen mode. Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect, Anna. Okay, perfect.
So,
Okay,
so
please.
should I
Yeah.
start? So,
Yes, please, Anna.
thanks very much. Of course, I have to start by thanking the organizers of this symposium for their very kind invitation to me to share some of the work we've been doing. This is indeed, this is indeed work in collaboration with several other people. Let me mention Julie Frank, Luigi Rizzi, my former student Maya Lila, and my PhD student now, Jing Dao Zhu, who have been actually quite important in the conduction of the experiments that I will report. The starting point for this research is a statement from Wexler 1998, where he argued that basic parameters are set at the earliest observable stages, meaning by that as early as children start producing two-word sequences. Yeah. When I talk about parameters, I am assuming that linguistic variation is encoded in parameters. Yeah, that's the assumption I will make throughout. So he argued that children, as soon as you hear them talk, know whether in their target language there's movement from V to T or movement from V to C, or whether there's, for example, null subjects that are legitimate. So let me exemplify that with Chinese. Here we have a child who's asked, tell auntie what rabbits eat. And the child answers, eat radish, they eat radish. This child knows that the subject can be dropped. It can be because Chinese licenses null topics, and also knows that the object has to be overt because that's what he's being asked about, so that the complement of the verb cannot be null. Now, you may want to say this is just one occurrence, but in actual fact, if we go through the spontaneous productions of children at this age or even younger, we find that they're very, very much target consistent. So the question that I want to address here is, if syntactic parameters are set by the time children start talking, when is it that they are set? And what do we know about parameter setting, in particular about the setting of syntactic parameters at an earlier stage when children are not talking yet? And in particular, I will consider two parameters. The parameter that determines whether the complement of the verb precedes or follows the verb, and parameters that are linked to object left dislocation, that is, the possibility of moving an object from its canonical position to some position on the left periphery, of the clause. And I'll do so with a variety of languages that we've looked at in our lab. So the antecedent of all this work was Hirsch-Pasek and Golinkov's 1996 work on 17-month-old children exposed to English. And they started with other people the so-called preferential looking paradigm, which is the paradigm that I'll be telling you about today. In this paradigm, you show the child two simultaneous videos on the left and the right of a screen. And one of the videos corresponds to the sentence the child hears and the other one doesn't. And you infer whether the child is understanding the sentence or not by monitoring the eye movement of the child. And you expect the child or the adult, you expect any participant who's understanding the sentence to direct their gaze preferentially to the video that matches the linguistic input. Now, in their results, they could see that English children at 17 months understood sentences like Big Bird is washing Cookie Monster, when they had on the screens a video with Big Bird washing Cookie Monster and another video with Cookie Monster washing Big Bird. So these children were sensitive to word order, clearly, but in itself, the comprehension of two does not really necessitate that these children know that the object follows the verb in English. They could simply understand two if they knew that, for example, the subject corresponding to the agent would appear in a specifier position that comes first. So to understand two, all you need to know is that Big Bird corresponds to the agent, but you may still not know that Cookie Monster has to come after the verb. So this was an open question, and let me exemplify that this first macro parameter that I'm going to talk about, what you have in 3 through 6 are cases in which we see that systematically the head of a phrase precedes its complement. So describing precedes the complement, the extraordinary events as a noun precedes its complement, the relative clause, or a preposition precedes its complement again. In other languages, such as Hindi, Urdu, that we'll talk about a little bit today, the situation is different, because when you have something like write a letter, you have the complement preceding the head, so the letter precedes write. And when you have a preposition that we might want to call postposition, this element follows its complement. Nevertheless, in languages like Hindi, Urdu, which is a very consistent head final language, we always find that there's some constructions that are not head final. So, for example, if you have an embedded clause that is a complement of a verb, that embedded clause must follow the verb rather than precede it. That's what's shown in 9 and 10. So, in general, it seems to be the case that head final languages, what we may want to call informally head final languages, are less harmonious than head initial languages. So, what might have appeared at the time as two options that languages have, that is, having complements following the head or having complements preceding the head, may not at all correspond to what's the case. The option, the possibility of having 12 has been questioned, was questioned by Keynes' anti-symmetry approach to word order. And I think that by now it is more or less unanimously agreed that only 11 is a possibility, and that what happens in languages that appear to be head final is that complements systematically move to the left, but do not always move to the left, and that would explain the lack of harmony in the so-called head final languages. So the setting of the VO versus OV parameter was first considered in an extremely important article, to my mind, Frank et al. 2011, and they first examined whether children acquiring French would know that French is a VO language, namely a language where the object follows the verb. And their method combined a preferential looking paradigm that I've already introduced, the use of pseudoverbs. So all the verbs in the experiments are verbs that children hear for the first time when the experiment is carried out, and the weird word order paradigm, whereby you expose your participants to word orders that are not well formed in their target language. I'm not going to detail now their method, because I will do it later with an experiment of our own, but we simply replicated their method. What they found is that at 19 months, French or infants exposed to French comprehend SVO sentences, but do not understand any longer SOV sentences. So that basically they have established that French is a VO language. So what we did in our own experiment with Luigi Rizzi, Julie Frank, Maya Lilla, was to look at what would happen in a language which was SOV, which is exactly the opposite of what French is. And we, on the basis of the French results, we expected children to direct their looks towards SOV event or to matching events when they heard a grammatical SOV sentence, and to ignore sentences that would be ungrammatical in the language at hand, Hindi, Urdu. And that would be based on not only the results by Frank et al. 2011, but also on the idea that children have abstract knowledge of word order by 19 months. Now, Hindi Urdu has some features that we might as well know before I start telling you about the experiment. Unlike French, nouns bear morphological case, arguments bear morphological case, and sentences are SOV as in 13, but there's a large number of other options in word order that are exemplified in 14. So all of these word orders are possible in Hindi Urdu. These have been investigated in the linguistic literature, and I will not go into that. We also carried out a study of spontaneous production to see what kind of input children would be exposed to. And what we saw is that really there's very many word orders that are possible in Hindi Urdu. That made it quite difficult to identify a word order that would be ungrammatical. We also saw that a large number of sentences were SOV. As you can see here, 44% of the sentences in our corpus were SOV sentences. So the materials which are due to Frank et al. Consist of 2 simultaneous videos. In one of them, there is a transitive event, which you have here on the left, where one of the characters performs an action on the other, and the distractor, which appears here on the right, depicts the very same characters carrying out the same event, but on themselves. What we have on the left is what we call the transitive event, and what we have on the right is what we call the reflexive event. And we carried out the experiment with 20 children of 19 months of age, none of them with a family history of language delay, language impairment, or cognitive impairment, and all of the children in the study were included in the final analysis. And the experimental sentences appear in 15 and 16. You have a target SOV sentence with a pseudoverb and a non-grammatical sentence, VSO, also ungrammatical due to the intonation pattern that was imposed on it. And 3 items of each type were presented to the children in succession, 3 grammatical, 3 ungrammatical. And the way that the data are recorded and afterwards analyzed is by means of what we call windows. There's one presentation of the video where there is a baseline sentence where a voice says, "Oh, look, what's happening?" And then there's 3 consecutive exposures to the experimental sentence. And analyses are conducted in these 4 so-called windows. And these are the results. What we have here are the proportion of looking time to the transitive event. And what we see in the red line is that when children hear the ungrammatical sentence, they're actually looking randomly across the 2 screens. And that's why the proportion of looking time is around 50%. Yeah, that's what one would expect if children are not understanding the sentence. If they're not understanding it, they don't know which of the 2 videos corresponds to the sentence, and they direct their looks likewise to one and the other video. However, when we presented them with the grammatical sentence, then there's 2 points here and here where, as we'll see in the statistics in a minute, where they direct their gaze preferably to the transitive event. And we take that, as in the previous studies, to mean that they're understanding the SOV sentence. So basically what we see here is the same that had been shown for French, only that here SOV is the grammatical sentence and Hindi Urdu children are understanding that sentence, which was ignored by the children exposed to French. This is a little bit more detail on the statistics. Maybe I should not go too much into it, but basically there's only a significantly longer look at the transitive event when they hear grammatical sentences, and that's during the second and the third presentation of a sentence. So are there alternative accounts to these facts other than saying that children have abstract knowledge of syntax? Well, one hypothesis that had been entertained is that children use perhaps not linguistic agent-first strategy, whereby they interpret the first argument as the agent. Now, if we applied that strategy to our results, we would really expect that children would understand SOV sentences, but we would also expect that they would understand VSO sentences as transitive, because in VSO sentences, the first argument is indeed the agent. So the prediction would be, under this alternative account, that children would perform with SVO, or SOV and VSO in the same way, and that's just not the case. There's another account, more removed perhaps from our theoretical standpoint, which is the usage-based approach of Tomasello and colleagues. Under this approach, children do not really have any abstract knowledge of syntax, and all they have are memorized verb templates. They know a verb and they know which arguments come with that verb, and they're able to understand sentences on the basis of those memorized templates. Now, since in our experiment, all the verbs that we used are pseudo-verbs, the prediction of the usage-based approach would be that children would be unable to understand any sentence, so that they would perform the same with VSO and SOV, and this prediction is not fulfilled. So neither of these alternative accounts actually succeeds in accounting for what we found. Yeah. Now, one question that one may want to ask at this point is there cross-linguistic variation in this? So it may be the case that French children understand, or children exposed to French understand SVO, and children exposed to Hindi Urdu understand SOV, but does that carry over to other languages? And Kandan et al. In 2012 argued that there is cross-linguistic variation and that children exposed to English understand canonical word orders earlier than children exposed to Turkish, and those earlier than those exposed to Mandarin Chinese. And they argued that this cross-linguistic variation can be attributed to the existence of multiple word orders in Turkish and Mandarin, and also to the existence of null arguments, which is especially pervasive, I think, in Mandarin Chinese, due to the existence of topic drop. Some of their measures were actually inconsistent with their result, but I probably don't have time to go into that. But we decided to replicate our experiment with Mandarin Chinese, and we had 17-month-olds exposed to Mandarin Chinese. We also administered the Mandarin version of the CDI, which is a measure of vocabulary for infants and for young and for toddlers. We created 2 pseudo-verbs again, and the experimental sentences here correspond exactly to the French word orders. So the grammatical SVO, which is exemplified in 17, and the ungrammatical SOV, which is exemplified in 18. And here are the results. So what we found was that there's a statistically significant difference in the mean looking time to the transitive event on the first exposure and the second exposure to grammatical sentences. When children heard ungrammatical sentences, or when they heard the baseline question, look what's happening, they directed their gaze randomly across the two representations, the transitive and the reflexive. It is only when they heard the grammatical SVO sentence that they directed their gaze preferably to the transitive event. And that happened, as I said, during the first and the second presentation of the sentence, not during the third. And that's easy to understand because these children are very, very young, and you may attribute that to simple tiredness. So, and this is a graphic representation, and we see here the 2 points at which children are directing their gaze towards the transitive event, and we take that to be comprehension. So here we replicate the results for French only at a much earlier age. We replicate them for 17-month-old children. Because we also had a measure of vocabulary and age, since the age range of the children in this experiment is quite wide, we could also perform some statistical tests to see if age or vocabulary size mattered, and the result is that it doesn't. There is no main effect of age within our range of ages, and there's no main effect of vocabulary size, and no interaction between vocabulary and condition or comprehension of the grammatical sentences. So this indicates that at the ages that we're targeting in our experiment, neither vocabulary nor age modulate the effect of grammaticality. So we have now provided for Mandarin Chinese evidence for the setting of the parameter that dictates VO as opposed to OV by 17 months of age. And the fact that no age effect was found in our results suggests that this parameter was fixed at an earlier age than the age tested. Because if the parameter had been set exactly at this age, we would probably have found an effect of age in the performance of children, which was not the case. So going back to the question that was raised in relation to Camden, I think we can safely say that we see no evidence for cross-linguistic variation in the comprehension of canonical word orders, at least in the languages we have explored, namely French, Frangadal, and in our lab, Hindi Urdu and Mandarin Chinese. Another question that arises now is, having seen the children understand these canonical word orders, do they understand other word orders that may be less frequent or less prevalent as well? And here our point of departure is again some work from University of Geneva, Lasota et al. 2014, and also now Romy Lasota's thesis from 2021, presented a study again with French infants in the comprehension of a particular case of non-canonical word order, clitic left dislocation, which is exemplified in 19. What you have here is a sentence which starts with the object, le garçon, the boy, then is followed by the subject, la fille, and then a pronoun that is co-referential with the object and a pseudo-verb. So this means the girl verbs the boy, but the superficial order is OS clitic verb. And the materials here consisted of 2 videos. One represented the target event and another one with fetal role reversal. They had 40 French learners of 22 months. And importantly, sentences with an object displaced to the left periphery are only 8% of the input that children get in their corpus study. And notice as well that in some work in the literature, the argument is made that children do not comprehend non-canonical word orders, for example, in German, until the age of 7 years. And here we're talking about 22 months. And here are the results. So this is the proportion of looks to the agent first representation. The agent first representation is indeed the correct one for SVO, and this is what we have on the continuous line. Here we see that children are directing their gaze preferably at on this exposure to the sentence to the agent first graphic representation. However, when you give them clitic left dislocation, they're not doing that. Rather, they're looking at the representation, which is not agent first, which is what adults would do as well. And we take, again, this to mean that children are comprehending clitic left dislocation. So we replicated this with, again, with a very different language and with a slightly different construction, or perhaps I should say very different construction, but it has certainly some features that resemble very much the clitic left dislocation in French, and that's the back construction in Mandarin Chinese. We know that children produce that when they start talking already, even though it is very scarce in the input. We conducted a corpus study, and we found that the back construction is present in 3% of Mandarin child-directed speech. That was worked by Zhu and myself, 2019. And when you have an object in the left periphery and a resumptive pronoun in the post-ba position, the presence of that in the input is even lower. It amounts to 1% in the input, according to Ye. So we are assuming the cartographic approach to this construction by soon 2018, but nothing really depends on this at this point. All we need to assume is that the object has moved from its canonical post-verbal position to a position to the left in either the T field or the C field, depending on the sentence, as we will see. There's some work that had been carried out before our work on the comprehension of the back construction in 2-year-olds by the forced choice pointing experimental paradigm, and to 2018 concluded children could comprehend these sentences at age 2. Here again, we had 17-month-old children, 24 of them. We also carried out the experiment with adults, but I will not go into their results. And again, the infants were administered, well, the infants, the parents answered the CDI version so that we had a measure of infants' vocabulary. And the experimental sentences are those in 22 to 24. In 22, we have an SVO sentence. In 23, we have the back construction with where ba is followed by a full object, the little duck. And notice, importantly, that 23 is minimally different from the construction we had on our first experiment, because what makes this sentence grammatical is the presence of ba. And in 24, we have the third condition in our experiment. We have an object, the little dog here, that appears on the left periphery, and a coreferential pronoun in the post-ba position. These are the materials. What we had in one scene is a transitive event that corresponds to the linguistic input, and what we have in the other is the same event with the reverse. Yeah. So here the dog is doing something to the cow, and here the cow is doing the same thing, but this time to the dog. And here are our results. So in our results, children looked at the target video for a significantly longer period of time when they heard SVO sentences for the second and the third time in the third and fourth windows. That means that in our interpretation that they comprehended SVO, which we had already seen in experiment 1. Then when they heard SBA OV sentences, they directed their gaze preferentially to the target video on the second exposure to the sentence. And in all the remaining windows, they directed their gaze randomly across the 2 screens. We take that to mean that they comprehended the SBA OV sentence. And with the OSBA OV sentence, they directed their gaze significantly longer at the target video on the first exposure to the sentence and the second exposure to the sentence. And in the remaining windows, the baseline and the third exposure to the sentence, they directed their gaze randomly across the two screens. So we take that to mean that they also comprehended this non-canonical sentence. And this is graphically represented here. These are the results in terms of proportion of looking time to the target video. Yeah. I think I've already gone through this. So when we looked at the effect of age and vocabulary size, again we found, or the interaction between age and vocabulary size and condition, we found that there was no effect whatsoever. So doesn't matter how young the children were within our group or how large their vocabulary was, their performance was guided by grammaticality and was independent of those other measures. So we would like to conclude from this that these children were able to parse non-canonical sentences just as much as they were able to parse canonical sentences in the first experiment, that we have evidence for the setting of the parameter that dictates the back construction at 17 months of age, which is younger, a younger age than the age for which French infants were tested. So we have better results here in the sense that we have younger children. And these results are consistent with the idea that word order acquisition takes place before production starts. And moreover, that this is independent of, say, the presence of null arguments in the input, or perhaps more importantly, this is independent of the frequency of the construction in the input. And this has implications for many frequency-based accounts on acquisition, including Young's generative variational model, which argue that when children are already at the productive stage, you can predict how early or late they will acquire a construction on the basis of its frequency in the input. And we are not opposed to the idea that frequency matters, but we think that if frequency matters, it has to matter earlier than 17 months, certainly not after. So these results also witness to the fact that after parameter setting has taken place, infants ignore sequences that are deviant in their target language. And we think that this is, an interesting finding because for a very long time, it has been known that in the acquisition of phonology, which takes place at a much earlier stage, infants start being open to any phonological distinctions that may be there, but that by 6 months of age, they have narrowed down the distinctions that their system makes. That means they have acquired the phonology of their target language and they have started ignoring things, that distinctions or features that do not pertain to their target language. We think that what we find here, starting with Frank et al.'s experiment, not our own, but we have shown repeatedly, is that children narrow down the syntax or the word orders they're willing to entertain, and they basically ignore all those word orders, so that what is basic in their comprehension is grammaticality. Putting aside the possibility that there may be other strategies in comprehension, within that grammaticality is the determining factor that guides comprehension in infants. And I guess that's it. So many thanks are due to the children who took part in the experiments reported, to my project, and of course, many thanks to Xiamen University and to the organizers of this event, and thanks to the audience as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to hear Maya and Jintao's work, and it reminds me very beautiful days in Barcelona. Thank you. I suppose there are some questions for you, because Teresa is still here, right? Teresa?
Should I stop sharing my screen or not?
It's okay for a moment. Genaro is here. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. So the sentences that you proposed, for example, the back construction or the critic left dislocation that was tested in some other work, were presented without any context?
Yes.
Yes. Because I wonder, I mean, at a later age, children may not understand. And I was thinking whether adding context would make it worse or better.
Okay. I can say, well, the context in the first experiment, I think that the sentences are broad focus sentences, the grammatical ones. Mm-hmm. So they're perfectly okay in the absence of context. Well, in actual fact, the baseline sentence is, oh, look, what's happening? So what comes afterwards is like the rabbit chases the rabbit verbs the dog, and that's perfectly pragmatically okay. So absence of context, or the kind of context we have in the first experiment, I think is perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. Now, it is true that in the second experiment, when we're giving our participants something like the back construction or critic left dislocation, this is extremely inappropriate in the absence of a context. Yeah, mm-hmm. I guess that's what you were thinking of. Now, something that's very interesting is that I didn't tell you about the results for adults, but in the results for the back construction for Mandarin adults, what we found was that adults took longer to identify the correct video than children, than the infants. So they only directed their gaze to the target video in the second exposure to the sentence rather than the first exposure to the sentence, while infants had been doing it from the first exposure to the sentence. So we carried out a follow-up experiment where we changed the context by adding an extra sentence that would make the back construction felicitous. And then this experiment was carried out with adults, and adults then identified the correct video from the first exposure to the sentence. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that seems to mean to us, I don't know if you agree, but it seems to mean that infants are more willing to comprehend even in the absence of an appropriate pragmatic context. Mm-hmm. That they're less sensitive to the pragmatic context than adults are. Mm-hmm. So
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anna, there's a question in the chatting window. Can you see it? From Zhang Yuquan from UCL.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'll be able to see it. Sorry.
So let me read it, okay? So, hola, Ana, gracias. And then, okay, muy atractiva or innovadora. I hope I pronounce it correctly, okay? Okay, so Yuqian said that regarding the experimental design, how can we make sure that the prolonged looking time are due to the perception of a...
Jenai, sorry, I can't. Regarding the experimental design, can you repeat what comes next?
Okay, how can we make sure that the longer looking times are due to the perception of a weird word order instead of other reasons? For instance, weirdness of pseudo words pronunciations themselves perceived by children as some certain sounds are harder to require. Okay, so she said, I'm not sure if the findings would be strengthened if we also introduce another set of stimuli of real verbs, a part of pseudo words.
Okay, but in our results, the pseudo verbs are present in both the grammatical and the ungrammatical, right? So if you expect the pseudo verb to have an effect, I think you would expect that effect to be present both in the grammatical and the ungrammatical, right? And as far as I'm concerned, I would expect children to perform exactly the same with real verbs. We only chose pseudo-verbs following the tradition of Frank et al. To have an argument against the usage-based hypothesis. I mean, this is just making things more difficult for children by using pseudo-verbs. So I don't think they would perform any differently if they had real verbs. But of course, we haven't done it, and it might be worth doing it, certainly.
Thank you for that clarification, Anna. Because I'm working on the bilingual sound production for typically development of bilinguals. Because I found that some of these sounds will be like more will be harder for the infant to acquire and learn. So I'm just wondering if we can like control this kind of variables and make our result more robust.
Okay. Well, in fact, we took care to make all our pseudo-verbs very much like real verbs, so that we control both in Hindi, Urdu, and in Chinese. We had measures that, you know, showing that the phonotactics of those verbs were matching real verbs. And we also asked adults to say whether those verbs sounded okay, or sounded Chinese, or sounded Hindi, Urdu, and they said yes, they do sound okay, but I don't know what they mean. So we did quite a bit of trials and looking at the pseudo-verbs. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias por la presentación.
Oh, gracias.
One more question.
All right. Okay. Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Hu. I got a question for Anna. Hi, Anna. You know, compared with the bar construction, the linguistic structure with SVO order is very frequent in, you know, in the interaction between children and their caregivers. So how can you take the evidence? How can you take your data as evidence to, you know, arguing against the usage-based approach to language acquisition? Of course, I'm in support of, you know, the biolinguistic approach to language acquisition, but I think maybe the reviewers will read such a question. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Well, with respect to the usage-based approach, in the predictions would be, in all of our experiments, whether the BA or the previous ones, the children would not comprehend anything. So the prediction would be that faced with two videos and sentences containing a pseudo-verb, children would not know how to go about it, because they would be hearing a verb for which they had no exposure and for which they could possibly not have any template. So we would expect that grammaticality would make no difference, and theta role reversal wouldn't make any difference either in the second experiment. So children would direct their gaze randomly across the screen. And that's not the case. So the predictions of the usage-based hypothesis are not fulfilled here. With respect to BA, I think that the prediction of the usage-based account would have to be that BA constructions would be understood later, but when I say later, I mean much, much later than the canonical SVO sentences. And that's not what we find, in the sense that what we find is that at 17 months, both are understood.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And the last question from the chatting window. So from Zhentao, she asked, according to your research, can we say 17 months is a milestone for early syntactic development with the parameters in word order?
Okay, nice. Sorry. According to your research?
Yeah. Can we say 17 months is a milestone for early syntactic development with a parameter setting of word order?
Well, all we can say is that we see comprehension at 17 months. I don't think that we can say it's a milestone because I think we have to investigate what happens with younger children. It doesn't look like at 17 months they're setting the parameter. It looks like it is set at 17 months. That's why they're, we looked at the age effect and there was no age effect. So if there is no age effect, when you look at children between 15 months and 19 months, it means that it must have happened before. So I don't think that, I wouldn't identify 17 months as a milestone. I would hope to find it at an earlier age, but I don't know how much earlier.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, please stop sharing the slides. So let's move to the.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah. Move to the speaker, Gennaro Chiacchia. Okay. Gennaro, now I'm going to introduce you, very brief introduction, okay? Could you please share the slides? Ciao. Hi. Okay, so Professor Gennaro Chiacchia is a Hess Foundation's Professor of Linguistics in Harvard University. And in fact, before the talk, I asked Gennaro, how should I introduce you? And he said, up to you. So I Googled and found there are description. In fact, this is how he described himself, okay? So let me read it. So I have been spending my intellectual life studying how meaning takes shapes in human language. A common thread in my work is the idea, claim, speculation that a logic, spontaneous growth, and latches onto the syntactic structures produced by our capacity for recursive computation. And this natural logic gives us special power to our ability to use language, to communicate and refer, a power not found in other species. Some more specific recurring themes or oppositions are properties and prediction, noun phrase structure, anaphora, and presuppositions, implications, and polarity phenomena. So I'm also very interested in pursuing these topics by experimental means. I hope. So I explained it very not so clear, okay? So let's move to Gennaro. Ciao, Gennaro. Welcome, Gennaro.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Shenai, for having me on this wonderful occasion. The first 100 years are very important, and so happy birthday to Xiamen. I'm going to be sharing my reflection on one of my obsessions, which is the mass count distinction. 1 second, this is not moving. And I'm not sure why. Okay. So the mass count distinction is cognitively based on the contrast between objects and substances, where an object is something bounded, cohesive, non-divisive, that moves as a unit through continuous path and retains its identity upon entering in contact with other objects. So things like tables, cats, and the like. Substances, on the other hand, are divisive, neither bounded nor cohesive, and they do not move as units, nor do they retain their identity upon entering in contact with other substances. And this definition stems from the work, a very extensive work of many cognitive psychologists like Zuccari, Lispelke, and many others, and seems to be present, the distinction between objects and substances, seems to be present in the pre-verbal child, and in fact, even in other non-human mammals. How does this cognitive distinction interact with grammar. And here we find a huge variation, particularly along 3 dimensions. One, the first type of variation can be thought of as a variation in conceptualization. So certain concepts seem to have equally natural conceptualization as substances and as objects. For instance, rope or rock. So when you say, I need a lot of rope, you are regarding it as a kind of a substance. But when you say, I need 2 ropes, you are regarding them as 2 objects, 2 distinct objects. Okay? And similarly for, say, beer, right? When you order 3 beers, you are on the 3 objects. But when you are drinking beer, you are ingesting a substance. So this is one type of variation. Another type of variation seems to be exquisitely grammatical. And here you may find 3 very major classes of languages. In certain languages, nouns seem to be pre-coded as mass and count. And you clearly find 2 distinct grammatical behavior in the nominal system, in that, for instance, numerals can combine directly with count nouns, and you can say things like 3 cats or 3 chairs, but you cannot say things like 3 bloods. Not easily, not without some conceptual restructuring of the word. So this is what happens in virtually all, not all, but virtually all of the Indo-European languages. On the other hand, you find languages like Mandarin, where you cannot directly combine a numeral with any noun at all. And you always need a classifier. You always need something that interpolates between the number and the noun. And finally, you find languages where you can combine numerals directly with any noun whatsoever. And there is no apparent sign of any distinction. And you can say things like, oh, I cut myself and I lost 3 bloods, which would mean something like, I lost 3 drops or 3 quantities of blood, okay? So this is another dimension of macro variation. And the third variation that I'd like to call your attention to are misalignments. That is to say, cases where a noun, which is somehow cognitively count, takes on the behavior of a mass noun. And I'm thinking of words like furniture, jewelry, luggage in languages like English. So, you know, furnitures come in discrete units, but yet you cannot say, you know, I bought 3 furnitures. Okay, so this is the case of misalignment. So how do we address this variation? What is going on? There are 2 radically different ways of approaching this variation. Think of the grammatical distinction. So there are languages with a clear mass count distinction in the nominal system. There are languages where nouns seem to act uniformly in a mass-like manner. And the languages where nouns act uniformly in a count-like manner. And so you might be tempted to conclude that in English, some nouns are lexically mass, others are lexically count. In Mandarin, every noun is mass, and in Nez Perce or Yuja, every noun is count. And so there are these 2 families of approach. There are relativistic theories, according to which any noun can have a count or a mass sense. And the link between the grammar and the pre-linguistic notion of object or substance is basically arbitrary. And then on the other hand, there are universalistic theory, according to which nouns do not change substantially their senses, and grammatical variation is due to something else, like covert uses of some resources or mapping principles that tap onto distinct logical types. And today, I want to address variation, arguing against relativism, and by providing a universal take on the type of variations that I've sketched. So what do we need to get started? And this is semantic, so you immediately are confronted with a bunch of formulae. But let me tell you what is behind this formula. So the first thing that you need to address the problem of the mass count distinction is a notion of unit or singularity or atom, right? And so you need to be able to see whether concepts, properties have atoms, apply to singularities, and that's clearly the key notion in this thing. And an atom is the smallest thing of which a concept is true. Okay, the smallest unit of which a context is true. So, for instance, a concept like cat is true of cats, and the smallest thing of which it is true is a singular or atomic cat. And counting requires atomicity, requires that concepts that you can isolate these smallest units, so to speak. Now, we fight to death on the notion of atomicity, and in the literature you find you find a lot of notions. I might as well tell you what I think. Although most of what I say, I try to make neutral with respect to this device. Okay. At the same time, we need something to sort of hang our intuitions on. So I might as well tell you what I think is going on, and how to think about the notion of atom. I think that the difference between a count noun and a mass noun is that this notion of minimal unit in mass noun is just too vaguely specified to be of any use in counting. So ultimately, the notion of atomicity is related to the notion of vagueness, believe it or not. And let me elaborate for 2 minutes on this notion of atomicity. So all properties are, to a certain extent, vague. So this means that they are not defined for everything. So there are certain things that we are sure belong to the property, other things that we are sure that they do not belong to the properties, and things that we are not sure of. Okay? So take, for instance, table. Table is true of the thing that is now in front of me. It's false applied to, say, this. This is not a table. And then there are things for which you are uncertain. For example, if you have a tabletop sitting in your garage, you may be uncertain as to whether that qualifies as a table or not. And you can resolve this vagueness in context. For instance, if you have extra guests, you can say, we can use the table in the basement by propping it up somehow. Okay? So a concept like table is definitely true of certain things, definitely false of other things, and perhaps undefined for things in the middle. Contrast this with what happens with something like rice. So rice, you are sure that something is rice if the amount is large enough. So if you have something that is at least 1 grain of rice, you may say, this is rice. What about half a grain of rice? Is that rice? You start becoming uncertain. And eventually, as you make it smaller and smaller, it will come a moment where you break out the molecule and you no longer have rice. But you don't know, and you are not interested in where that line falls. And so this is the key difference, right? So something like rice applied to half a grain may be undefined. But if you take cat and you apply it to half a cat, you know that that is not a cat. And that's the difference. Okay? So there are things that you're sure are going to be cats, and they are going to be stable. And instead, when it comes to small units of anything mass, you will be uncertain. And that's what I think the notion of atomicity is based on. This actually has a precise logic. Vagueness has a beautiful logic, a modal logic. And, it's kind of can be spelled out in a way which is actually testable. And the take home of this part is a property P is count if in any sort of standard world, anything which is an atom there stays an atom for every way of sharpening your criteria. On the other hand, a property is mass, if it's not count, which means that in base world, there are things that you might be willing to regard as the smallest aggregates of water or rice in that world that are going to turn out to be made up of, they turn out to be aggregates as you sharpen your criteria. This is the intuition, and I will have to leave you with this. And so I'm thinking of a distinction between nouns that are stably atomic, like cat, chair, and so on, and properties that are not stably atomic. And for counting, you need stable enough atoms. All right. How do we think within this setting about variable conceptualization? So the difference between the count sense of rope and the mass sense of rope. So the count sense of rope is something like this, right? It's a bounded, undetached, strong cord made by twisting together strands of hemp or some similar material. Rope mass is any possibly undetached length of strong cord made of the same material. So in going from the mass sense of rope to the count sense of rope and vice versa, the units change. And to qualify it as a count rope, you have to be a whole undetached cord, while any perceivable length of cord qualifies as rope mass. And we do not really know or care for minimal units of rope mass in this sense. Now, there are natural ways of shifting between these two senses. So you could imagine a sort of way of packaging, a packaging function that applies to a mass noun and yields a corresponding natural count sense, which would be true of standardized portions of the mass sense. So if you have beer as a liquid, the packaging function would give you standard servings of beer, like a beer glass or a beer bottle or whatever. Vice versa, you can think of a grinding function. And the grinding function applies to something that is count and delivers a correspondingly natural mass property, typically true of parts of anything in the extension of the count property. And you want these functions to be well behaved in a certain mathematical sense. Now, these functions are variable. So, for example, in English, shelf is definitely count. And so the grinding function in English applying to shelf is undefined. But if you are in a community of English-speaking woodworms, they could say to each other things like, I had too much shell to eat yesterday, and I